Our next panel is Women Whistleblowing and the Me Too movement. Why has it changed the way that we work? It's actually surprisingly little research on women and whistleblowing. Some international research says that women are more likely to be retaliated against. And we will hear from our panel today some of the kind of retaliation that they face, and indeed how women's concerns are often silenced. I will hand you over to our legal director, Sybille Raphael, to introduce our panel today.
The world changes and whistleblowing changes with it. It used to be mostly about banks, the NHS, financial misconduct and patient safety. The public interest now covers a much wider canvas, including sexual harassment at work, not just a private individual issue. On the Protect Advice line, we hear about toxic culture and stories like Sophie's, who told us she was groomed and coerced by the charismatic senior manager and sees the same pattern repeated with every young woman joining the company. Or like Elias, a cleaner who reported sexual assault by the caretaker of an office building she was cleaning, and so her contract abruptly ended as a result. This has brought to the fore new questions about how the law should work. Settlement agreements with NDAs allowed wrongdoers with deep pockets like Harvey Weinstein to operate with impunity for decades. Hey, wonderful. So NDAs allowed wrongdoers to operate with impunity for decades in a system where their victims were silenced one by one. That is why the whistleblowing law in the UK needed to expressly set out that confidentiality clauses are null and void if they prevent a worker from whistleblowing. But breaching an NDA still takes an awful lot of courage, if only because the law is complex. And having to convince a judge that what you were doing was whistleblowing, not defaming or disparaging your ex-employer, is quite rightly horribly daunting. And what about the many, many women whose stories will not be of interest to a national newspaper? And how about the downfalls of going to the press and having your name revealed as a victim of sexual harassment? I'm very honoured to debate these questions today with a dream panel. Zelda Perkins, who blew the whistle on Harvey Weinstein, co-founded and co-chairs Can't Buy My Silence, a campaign to ban the misuse of NDAs. Lubna Shuja is the first Asian, first Muslim and seventh female president of the Law Society, which in July this year publicly urged the government to commit to making it harder for NDAs to be misused when they involve settling issues around workplace harassment or discrimination. Caruana Galizia is an award-winning journalist who became such after his mother, Daphne, was assassinated because of her investigative journalism. He was behind the reporting that led to Crispin Odey's downfall this summer. Beth Hale is a partner at CM Murray with wide experience of managing sexual harassment disputes in the workplace, both from the employer's and the workers' point of view. Tas Brooker is an award-winning producer who directed When We Speak, a film exploring the experiences of female whistleblowers, which we will screen later today. So Paul, has the world really changed post-Me Too? And thinking about what happened in OD asset management, why does it take journalists to get those concerns listened to?
So I'm really sorry I'm late, especially as the token man. I think, so thinking in terms of the Crispin Odey story, I think you can make a case that the world has changed. So the story in brief is about a man, a very wealthy hedge fund manager, who set up a hedge fund company in 1991, and really ever since then has been trailed by rumors that he mistreated women. So the allegations are of sexual assault and harassment. So some of the allegations against him dated back to the issues I reported on to the late 90s. and continued up until really the present. So the most recent one is from 2021, an allegation of sexual assault. The woman who he assaulted, in '98, actually complained to the police about him in 2017, precisely because she read all the Me Too reporting. So she saw all the stuff about Harvey Weinstein and thought, this happened to me. It happened to me in 1998. I'm shocked to hear it's still happening, and apparently in other industries as well, not just finance. So she went to the police, complained about him. The case actually did go to court, where he was acquitted of indecent assault, I should say. So that is a direct consequence, right, of all the Me Too reporting. In other ways, the world hasn't changed in that the behavior continues. So again, the more recent allegations ran up to 2021, which is post-Me Too, post-Weinstein.
And Beth, do you see that reflected in the workplace?
So, I mean, I think from my perspective, the world has changed beyond all recognition. It sounds like a Bond film title, but obviously the world has not changed enough. But I think there has been a sea change in practice, for lawyers, for employers, in terms of their approach to sexual harassment. We routinely, and not all the time, of course, but we routinely see senior men, not always men, obviously, but largely, being exited where complaints have been made by more junior women, in a way that, 10 years ago, it would have always been the woman who was exited. So I think you look at this panel, has the world changed? Yes, it has. There's a token man on a panel like this. It's that's also, that is changed. But I think from sort of perspective from which I'm talking, has it changed in law and in practice in terms of NDAs? Yes, it has. Employment lawyers are talking about, thinking about, writing about whether an NDA is appropriate, whether an NDA is necessary, whether it's, if it is necessary or if it is deemed necessary, whether the drafting is correct. You see NDAs, which used to be a one-line, sort of, you shall never say anything, now taking up a whole page with all the caveats, and lawyers really focusing on clarity in drafting and understanding, and the advice that they give to clients about what they're signing up to, and really importantly, what they're not signing up to. I think that has changed beyond all recognition. So is there still work to do? Of course there is, but has the world changed? Absolutely.
Lubna, in your press release in July, you called for regulators to address an organization's failings, mentioning harassment specifically. Why and how do regulators shape better behavior?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I mean, rule of law applies. We live in a democracy. Rule of law means everybody, no matter what their background, no matter what their means, they're all, should be subject to the same law. And if regulators are putting proper boundaries in place, putting proper guidelines in place, that means we lead to better practices. I think Beth's already spoken about, the way that lawyers are now dealing with non-disclosure agreements in a much more considered way than perhaps was previously the case. The Law Society, we have issued guidance, practice notes on our website to make it very clear to lawyers what kind of things they need to take into account when they're looking at putting in place non-disclosure agreements. The SRA also has a warning notice on their website. That warning notice also sets out what kind of things should not be included in an NDA. It sets out best practice when you are advising people who are coming to you, both parties actually, not just one or the other. If you've got a party on the other side that is not represented, the solicitor is ultimately responsible for making sure that that party also understands what they're signing. It's very clear to them. They understand the implications. They understand what's permissible and what's not permissible. So I think regulators have got a very important role to set the boundaries and the guidelines to make sure that everybody is very clear and there is clarity on how we go forward.
But to go back to the wrongdoing, Zelda, we know that in some cases, the only way to stop the wrongdoer is to go to the press. But this is anything but easy for the whistleblower. On the protected advice line, we call it the nuclear option. You waited 20 years before you did so. Why? And what did going public entail for you?
Well, it looks like I waited 20 years, but I didn't actually wait 20 years. I tried consistently from the moment that the assault happened to go the official route. And sadly, the official route was always a brick wall. And it continued to be a brick wall in the 20 years from 98 when it happened to even now. There are still lots of brick walls because I deal with men and women on a weekly basis who are still being made to sign totally egregious NDAs and are not getting the help that they should have. Every time I spoke up, I was silenced in different ways. I silenced myself in many ways because I moved to Central America because I realized that I wasn't very good at keeping quiet. And if I stayed at home, I thought I would probably end up in prison because I wouldn't be able to stick to the clauses in my NDA. An NDA, by the way, which I wasn't allowed to hold. So I couldn't actually check what my clauses were. But it was an NDA that said that I had to use my best endeavours not to aid the police, that I was not allowed to speak to a therapist, that I had to direct the HMRC to Allen and Overy if my settlement payment was questioned. And although many of the clauses in that agreement were totally unenforceable, I wasn't to know that. And I think that's the issue with NDAs, is that it's a practice that goes on in secret. Because I couldn't hold my NDA, I could never get a second opinion on it. It's still, my own lawyers threatened me with High Court if I wanted to get my NDA from them, and that was in 2017. So this is after guidance, it's after warning notices. We went through an SRA investigation, and the SRA unfortunately didn't have enough powers to make the things that needed to happen. Going public essentially was ultimately the only way, and it's a knife edge, because I think, you know, as we're seeing every day, every week now, there are more people coming forward, more people breaking their NDAs, more people feeling confident that they can speak about misconduct and mistreatment, and I think it's a pity that it still has to be played out in such a public domain, because that also has a negative effect on employers and makes them want to also hide the problem even more than sort of following on from their poor past habits. So in many ways, I think there needs to be more balance, but until I think legislation changes and the regulatory bodies actually change their guidance rather than just give warning notices, which, by the way, the guidance from the SRA has not changed since 1998. The only thing that has changed are whistleblowing laws. So the guidance isn't any different. And right now, the conversation is very different because it's in the public eye. But I don't believe that unless there's regulatory change and legislative change to support this and to support lawyers to make the right decisions, I don't think there will be a change.
And to go back a little bit to the toll it takes to go public, we've heard Helen Evans this morning saying that she had to relocate after she went to the press. Tas, your film explores the aftermath, the toll it took for 3 women whistleblowers to go public, and what's the common thread here? What's the common thread?
Quite often the after effects, that's what we really wanted to focus on. Once I spoke to 5, 10 whistleblowers, everyone had a very, very similar experience, and it was the aftermath of being secluded. There was often some kind of PTSD or fear. Trust had gone just in general. It was harrowing to hear people's post-whistleblowing experience, some of which they'd not been guided on, you know, especially after they'd spoken to the press, you know, having to relocate, as you would have heard from Helen Evans, I mean, what happened to Helen afterwards was quite shocking. You know, there was a breakdown of her marriage, having to relocate, being spat at on the street, and that was just for speaking up against abuse. I found that shocking to hear, and I wanted to focus my documentary on that. It wasn't so much the act of whistleblowing, it was how society and everyone else treats whistleblowers and how we need to be better as a society. Obviously not people in this room who know how to treat whistleblowers better, but as a society, why is there a backlash against people that speak up? And, you know, part of that is there's a silence in the law, there's laws with NDAs to silence people, but also there's stigma, you know, are they a grass? There's almost this, it is black and white, but there is this grey line. You're kind of brought up to not tell, to tell tale, not tell on someone else, you know, keep it quiet, keep it between us. And that we found moved into adulthood, and the playground moves into the workplace, that almost bullying people to be quiet. And as with your case with Weinstein and everyone that we featured in the film, there was, you know, the bully at the top that silenced everyone else. And the aftermath for everyone was the same. And I really wanted to focus on that on the film. It was what each one of them went through afterwards.
So we mentioned the law. Beth, can you explain what's the tension between getting the concern listened to and coming under the protection of whistleblowing law? Why is it so difficult for media disclosures to be protected disclosures under UK?
There's a sort of sliding scale of where protection kicks in. And the easiest way to get protection for a disclosure is to do it through the channels at your employer. The hardest way and the highest bar is if you want to go public. And you know, there are obvious, sensible reasons for that. But actually, there should be internal procedures to deal with whistleblowers, to deal with concerns raised in the workplace. And as you describe it, absolutely rightly, going to the press, going to the media is a nuclear option. But that's why there's that sliding scale in Public Interest Disclosure Act that creates that difficulty and that tension.
And Lubna, how can we clarify this? You called for the government to improve the legal framework around the NDAs. Why, and what do you have in mind?
So, I mean, just coming back to some of the other things that we've talked about, I should say that just stepping back a second, the SRA practice note or warning note was actually issued in 2020, and we issued guidance on the back of that as well. And it does set out very, very clearly, and I think it's worth just mentioning this so that we have a framework of where solicitors are now and where they're being asked to, how they're being asked to deal with these kind of things now. You know, solicitor has got an interest to act in the best interest of the client, but they absolutely have to uphold proper administration of law. They've got to make sure that they act with independence, with integrity, maintain public confidence in the system. And if they don't do that, and if they act in ways where they are taking advantage of people, or they are putting clauses that are not enforceable, or not providing a copy of an agreement to somebody who signed it, they absolutely should be providing a copy to them. These are disciplinary offences. You know, their regulator will take action against them for that. And, you know, talking about the government, moving on to, what you were saying, the government has already mentioned and indicated, and sadly I don't know how far it is up the agenda now because there seem to be so many other things going on, but the government has made commitments to strengthen the regulation around non-disclosure agreements so that it is harder to silence people, so that it is harder to use confidentiality clauses to stop people making disclosures to enforcement agencies, police, tax officials, HMRC, whatever. That shouldn't happen. There should be no confidentiality clause that prevents those disclosures. And, if somebody does try to put in a clause such as that, they will absolutely action will be taken against them. So we want to see that being enshrined into law, and we're pushing for that to happen. Whether it will happen, I don't know. We've seen recently what's been going on. Governments focus is on many, many other things, but certainly we would like to see this up the agenda so that the warning note and the guidance note that we're putting out, they do become enshrined in law. At the moment, they aren't any guidance, they aren't any warning. One of the things that we're really, really keen to see is culture changing within organisations. That's really, really important. We can put out guidance notes, we can put out warning notes, but actually you need to see organisations themselves, and I think it's happening more and more now, embracing the concept that everybody is equal, everybody needs to be treated equally, nobody should feel that they are in a worse position, whether they're advised or not advised. And there is a responsibility on solicitors to make sure that anybody signing an agreement is very, very clear about what they're signing. So we want to see, and we really push for getting policies in place so that it is black and white within an organisation. What is your whistleblowing policy? Who can you go to report? How do you report? If you're putting in a complaint against a senior person within the organisation, where else can you go to report if it's not that person? And it's about changing the culture from the very top, because I think that's historically actually been part of the problem. Where we've had complaints coming in against senior people, those senior people have been influential in shutting them down. That shouldn't happen. We need to see right from the very top an open culture where people feel safe to come and report. They feel that there is a place that they can go and speak, where they will be listened to and where action will be taken. And there is a very clear framework setting out, what's the process? Who do you go to? What happens next? How do we deal with it? And to encourage people to come forward.
I'm just going to add something to your piece about the SRA warning notice, which is, it's something which has been a big part of the change in practice, I think. But it's worth saying the SRA recently issues a thematic review. So they did a load of research with law firms on their use of NDAs, both internally but also externally, how they draft them for clients. And a lot of the thematic review which came out of that was very reassuring. It did show that there has been, that it supports my view that there has been a real change. But there was some quite, I think, concerning statistics around the knowledge in the legal profession of the warning notice. Just as one example of I think 64% lawyers spoken to said they were aware of it, which leaves a huge number of people working in employment law who say they're not aware of the warning notice on NDAs, and these are the people who are routinely drafting them. So there is. That's when I say, yes, change has happened. It's not gone far enough yet.
Training, isn't it?
Training, raising awareness.
Education and training.
Absolutely.
Part of that.
And we've heard this morning from Protect's Director Policy and Comms that imposing standards on employees is very much one of the things that Protect campaigns for. And indeed, we would want the whistleblowing policy, or at least explaining what you do when you see something that's not quite right, to be part of the mandatory information that needs to be given to every employee when they start. Yeah. But Zelda, you think we need to take the much more drastic route and ban NDAs altogether? Why?
Well, only ban them in their inappropriate use. So obviously, NDAs have a very important role in protection of IP and trade secrets and client confidentiality, etc. But one of the other things I wanted to bring up is, even if we're looking at what the SRA are doing, what the Law Society is doing, what the LSB are doing, clearly the LSB are worried about this, otherwise they wouldn't have opened this consultation this year into solicitors' solicitors' conduct. But increasingly, one of the things that I'm seeing is that people who have got NDAs, these NDAs have been written by ChatGPT. And so they've come from the HR department. So I think, this isn't just, when I started this whole journey, I thought it was two very simple things: change legislation, tighten up regulation. but actually our world is changing. And those two things both take a little bit of time. But even in the progress that's happened in the 5 years that I've been in this environment, you know, we have had a huge cultural change in terms of how people are beginning to draft legal documents. And that's a whole nother kind of onion to unpeel. But it isn't always ethical or unethical solicitor or internal lawyer who are providing these agreements. And I think ultimately it's a very, very clear, simple point. You cannot have a legally enforceable agreement that is hiding misconduct or potential harm. And whatever anybody says, they are still being made every day. And, you know, lawyers have duty to the court and duty to justice first and foremost, and client second. But particularly in the cases of very powerful people, that becomes a very difficult line for them to walk. But it isn't always powerful people. You know, if you work at McDonald's, your line manager is still the person who has power over you. And they have just as much power to have you shut down. And there just is not a place. I don't see where there is a place morally, ethically, or humanly to allow the law to enable or hide harm.
We'll explore SLAPs, so other legal ways that the law is used and abused to silence whistleblowers and journalists later this evening. But you know, echoing what you said about the line manager at McDonald's, beyond the law, Paul, maybe you can help us here. What are the non-legal ways people are silenced, and how do we combat those social pressures?
So the interesting thing, I suppose, for this audience in terms of the Odie story is, in the end, we reported allegations by 13 different women. The only one who went on the record is the only one who had signed an NDA with Odie Asset Management. With all the others, the pressure was, as you said, non-legal. So he targeted women who he knew socially, and one of them told me, I thought this was really striking. One of them told me, "I'm really anxious. I'm really nervous about speaking up. I don't want to become a social pariah," she said, which I thought was a really extraordinary reversal of what the norms should be. So that's one. And then, of course, there's the McDonald's issue that Zelda mentioned. So he also targeted young women who worked at his firm. So he had this power of coercion as their employer. So those are two things. As a journalist, it's often the kind of social pressure that seems to bear down on sources more than anything. When a source says, "Look, I signed an NDA," I think, okay, or rather, there are confidentiality provisions that come with my employment contract. I think, okay, everyone has those. There's obviously another issue at play here. And it's usually about talking those things through. It's usually the non-legal things, I find, that really matter.
And how can we change that? How can we, help follow-on guys work and help change the discourse?
So earlier you described going to journalists as the nuclear option. I would say it's not. And the more you speak about these things, actually, I think the better and the easier it becomes.
But journalists do have a duty of care to their sources, and
which we take incredibly seriously. So the Odie story was easily one of the most demanding, if not the most demanding, I've ever worked on, because you're handling really 13 women's allegations we reported. There were many more, but it's not like you call them up, they tell you everything, and you run it. You know, it took months of talking through the risks, the process, what it involves, that ultimately we would have to put their allegations to Crispin Odey himself, right? There always comes a point where you have to say, this person is saying this about you. What is your response? Which is a scary thing. And he identified at least one of the women and approached her, which was uncomfortable. But you have to consider all these things. You have to weigh how important it is to report their allegations, what the risks to them are. Everyone has to be fully informed of what's happening. I think that's, I don't know if all journalists do it, but certainly good journalists always walk through the entire process with their sources.
And Tas, I know because you were dealing with very vulnerable women as well, you took that to heart. Can you expand a little bit on your duty of care to the women whistleblowers you interviewed?
Yeah, definitely, because I spent about 2 years making the film, and at different stages with each of them, we saw the progression and lows and highs and ups and downs of what they went through. So yeah, we offered counselling as well to those that were discussing. There were moments where I think with Erica Chung, who was the Theranos whistleblower, where she almost, even though we'd been chatting for a while, she was almost not going to come to the interview, and we set up in California, and I was doing it remotely, and she was almost like, I don't know if I can do this. And again, we understand, it's like, you're not pressured to. You don't have to. It's fine. Come if you want to. But then there was, I think she felt on top of that there was a duty to keep talking and keep getting it out there and keeping it out.
Zelda, you've not...
Sorry. Yeah. It's such a difficult position for the victims, because you're the ones who always have to do all the work, and you're the ones who never get any reward. And I feel incredibly privileged that I've been able to make something positive and put my energy into something positive and moving forward and trying to make a change. But I can tell you, we're all very aware of how many women came forward because of Weinstein. And all of those women who've gone public, not all of them have had the luxury of having something positive come out of it. And the only positive thing that has come out of it for me is the job that I'm doing, not that it's a paid job. So donations welcome. The work that I'm doing, and the fact that I know that the more I keep speaking, the more other people will be protected. In terms of the impact that it's had on my life, it's huge. And personally, I wouldn't say it's positive. And as a whistleblower, first of all, you're somebody who has a crime or something unpleasant happen to you. Then you have to make the decision to go to somebody. Then you have to make yourself look believable. You then go through, certainly for me, went through a legal process, and for me that was the hardest, because the moment I went to lawyers, that was when I was shut down by my own lawyers, and they weren't doing anything wrong. It was just the reality of the situation. And going to, or speaking to the press, ultimately was the nuclear option, and it is the nuclear option. And not all journalists are ethical and are careful, like Tas and Paul. You're so isolated. And I spent 2 years in the sort of shark tank of all global media wanting to speak to me, and wanting to speak to all of us. And you don't know what their agenda ultimately is. And even with the journalists who take care of you, ultimately, it's their job. They're being paid to do this. It's a story. It goes out in the press. They may look after you really well during that process. But at the end of the day, your anonymity has gone. Your life has changed. You don't get any compensation or any rewards for having done that, apart from your own ethical feeling of having done the right thing. And I think the most important thing, which Lubna is talking about, is there has to be cultural and social change, and that happens within companies. You know, there was a big step this year in legislative change. You know, we managed to get NDAs prohibited in higher education. Now, that may seem like a small thing, but actually higher education was one of the worst offenders with NDAs. There was, over a 3-year period, they were discovered to have spent nearly 90 million on secret settlement agreements. Now in all higher education, it is prohibited to use an NDA for sexual misconduct, assault, discrimination, bullying between staff, students and visiting speakers. And the government has now admitted that there should never be an agreement that stops you from speaking up. Now, that started because we asked universities to sign a voluntary pledge. So it started the conversation, it started those universities really looking at what they were doing. And we're trying to replicate that now with business. And, you know, it's a voluntary pledge. What am I going to do if Google sign up to this and then somebody comes to me as a whistleblower? I can't enforce the pledge, but the point is the conversation is starting. And to make the change within companies and within firms, you have to change culture, and people have to look at whistleblowers not as brave people, not as troublemakers, not as extraordinary, but the norm. And it's funny because it's two sides of the same thing. You know, as a child, you're always told to speak up, you know, to say if something bad happens to you.
Yeah, so your parents say that. But
Yeah,
kids,
and the teachers and everything. And then
peers don't.
Yeah, but the kids don't. And so, you know, actually, as you say, it's the playground has moved into the workplace, because actually you should be being not rewarded either. It should just be normal to speak up in the workplace. And it doesn't have to be escalated to HR, and it doesn't have to be escalated to silencing. It should be dealt with immediately at root and calmly, and not have to go nuclear and go to the press.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Michael.
Good afternoon. Really brilliant discussion. I'm a patron of, one of the patrons of Protect. The reason why is that I was a so-called whistleblower, which can mean many things, when I exposed a $2 billion fraud at Olympus. But what shocked me, and this is really directed to the two lawyers, Beth and Lubna, the Weinstein case, which was truly shocking, and the Crispin Odey case were both brought about not because of people going to the police and the judicial process. It was because of the power of the media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Financial Times, which carried out, you know, this brilliant journalism, but it, you know, without the press. If I go to a dinner, I'll always sit next to a journalist, because my experience, who again saved me, the journalists were the ones which got the story out. Choose a profession which is poorly paid, you know, brilliantly talented people, but poorly paid. Corporate lawyers, and this is why I think Lubna's right. Corporate lawyers. No, I know you're not. No. I know you're not. No, I'm not attacking you on this. No, but corporate lawyers, very different to the lawyers who work for Protect. I came across those people head on. Both Odey and Weinstein film production company were advised by the very best lawyers in the world. When I ran away from Tokyo, literally running for my life because of the links with the alleged links with the Yakuza, and having armed guards, firstly, I couldn't find a law firm because they were all conflicted, because powerful organizations have a tactic of all the big firms. I did find one, Louis Silkin, and then a week later they found out, because of a German partner's link with the firm Olympus, and I had to go again, and eventually Simmons & Simmons unusually were on the side of the small man and not the corporate. But the point of a non-disclosure agreement, I mean, I think Zelda is absolutely right. It can be anything to do with, it could be, in my case, fraud, but if it's sexual harassment, sexual assault, what is in education should apply everywhere. And I wouldn't allow the corporate lawyers to follow some code of practice. I completely agree with you. It's got to be embodied in law. Why would we have a process? Because when I started taking on Olympus, and I was the chief executive, I was unusual because I was one of a few foreign gaijin in Tokyo. The world's media, I could get their attention, but even so, I spent £1 million in 12 weeks with lawyers. Went on, Olympus then subsequently launched an action, £26 million, this action in the High Court in London. And most people simply haven't got those resources or the attrition. So I don't think lawyers are any worse or any better than businessmen. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly, but they shouldn't be the people who decide. It should be the law of this land which say you should never have a non-disclosure agreement if it is hiding, not intellectual property or competitive stuff, of course, all that commercial stuff should be protected, but it should never, ever, and if it's done in education, it should be done uniformly. You shouldn't have an agreement which is protecting people from criminal actions.
Michael, great. That's not really a question, though.
Oh, sorry, it's a rant. Sorry. No.
You've got no, I mean, I wouldn't say anything against any of that.
Nor would I. The only thing I would say is that you talk about it being a code of conduct for lawyers. I think actually having the threat of regulatory action is as serious for lawyers, if not potentially more so, than the threat of legal action. I know you're shaking your head, Zelda, but you can settle legal claims. If you have claims against you as a lawyer, you can settle it. You can't settle regulatory claims in the same way. You lose your career if you have enforcement action taken against you by the regulator for breach of the warning notice, for example, on NDAs. You have the threat of losing your career, losing your livelihood, being struck off. That's an extreme example, but I think that it's not just a meaningless code of conduct. Sorry?
If there was another Crispin Odey case or Weinstein case, could it happen again now? Oh. Would the lawyers be held in breach of the guidelines in relation to NDAs?
Absolutely.
They would be.
Well, so Zelda's NDA is in breach of the warning notice, absolutely.
But nobody's been disciplined.
Well,
I would just like to
think that's...
put that out. I mean, I can only, obviously, I'm not saying this is across the board. No.
Just put that out there, I'm not the SRA.
And also, I can only speak from my own experience.
I'm not seeking to at all.
But that should not have happened. That's the key thing.
Yes, it shouldn't, and that's why change needs to happen. The SRA weren't powerful enough to deal with it.
I think the SRA have...
Well, okay, we have another...
I'm not here to speak for the SRA.
Anybody here from the SRA?
Maybe we can take them together, because we're running short of time. So if you can both ask your questions and we'll answer together.
Ian Foxley. Michael, I have the same experience.
Ian, real questions.
The question is actually taking on from Michael's rant, is how do we create equality of arms? Because the real problem is the individual versus the organisation. The individual does not have the resources to employ the quality or quantity of lawyers that the organisation can. And it's the inequality of arms in the legal field that is the real problem here.
Very good question. We had another.
Hello. So first of all, thank you so much, Zelda, for all that you're doing. It's not easy. And also just say, Tas, you know, I think it was a very powerful thing having a woman producer tell the story of women whistleblowers. And just my question here is, you've got an opportunity to influence the room. If there was one thing you wanted people to do differently as they go back into their workplaces, what would that be to address the issue that you've been talking about as a panel?
Two very good questions. How do we create equality of arms, and what is the one thing that we could do to make it better? Who wants to go first?
Well, on the equality of arms point, just coming back again to the warning, I know we keep talking about the warning note and the guidance, but the SRA, they've made it very, very clear that if a lawyer is dealing with a non-represented person on the other side, the duty is actually on the lawyer to make sure that the person on the other side is very clear about what they're entering into, obligations, you know, I've said this already, what's permissible, what's not. So actually, even you can't take advantage, it is a disciplinary offence to take unfair advantage of somebody just because they're not represented. You've got to make sure that you're not taking advantage of them in any way. And there's a whole list of things in the warning note that sets out, this is what could be deemed to you taking advantage of somebody. So on that point, I think you know, it comes down to the lawyer on the side of the person who's drafting the, you know, who's drafting the NDA.
At Protect would go even further. We said actually the whistleblower needs legal advice. Helen made that point, and that's why we exist. And that's
about legal aid. And
exactly.
Absolutely agree with you on equality of arms, and I don't see that there's an easy solution, but it is a problem that has to be solved.
What is the one thing each of you would want to share with the audience? That is the one thing we could do to make things better.
Speak to journalists.
Good journalists.
I agree with Zelda, of course, on limiting the use of NDAs in the way she's explained. It's funny, people go to journalists when they've exhausted all other options. They've tried their HR department, they've tried the police, they've tried the regulator, right? In the OD story, women had tried all those things. They went to the police, they went to the FCA, they went to OD's lawyers, actually, OD the firm, which happened to be Simmons & Simmons. But none of these things worked. Not a single one of them had any, at least none of them had the effects the women wanted. I think a kind of awareness which comes through reporting of the costs and benefits of speaking up. I've become quite skeptical of internal processes to handle these complaints. I see them almost now as ways of suppressing them. So I would probably avoid those.
Oh, well, that's not what we want to hear. And for one, horror stories, there are multiple happy ending stories where actually because of the processes that, because of the structures that are in place, things are being picked up. But you are perfectly right that they're not enough, and you do need something if they're not enough. Beth, one thing.
Culture change within organisations, leaders leading from the front, creating a culture of openness and talking about where things have gone wrong and talking about their mistakes, where they've seen things happen, and so bringing that up through the organisation, right from the very top of an organisation. So it's not easy, but I think it can be done.
Lubna?
Yeah, I agree with Beth. I mean, one of the things that we've been doing at the Law Society, and certainly since I've been president, is a real focus on ethics, because this is about culture change. It is about getting people to be able to talk about these things. I mean, I think that's the other problem, that people are actually frightened to have these conversations. And what we've done is we have actually set up on the Law Society website a professional ethics hub where members can go to get advice, to find out how others are dealing with issues that may have arisen, where there may not be a black and white answer, which is coming back to, you know, having policies in place, wanting to see legislative change, so that, you know, it is very clear what the process is and where people stand.
Zelda, one thing.
No, I'm not very good at short answers. I mean, obviously the short answer is, in this case, is stop the use of NDAs. And actually, I think the question is a good question, but not actually right, saying having equality of arms. There shouldn't be arms. We shouldn't be in that position. And I think so much of the conversation in this arena for the last 5 years has been how to make NDAs better, how to make these issues better. You need to go back to the root. There shouldn't be that situation. A settlement agreement is about agreeing not to take something further legally. It's not about having a fight about how to shut somebody up or how to the damage limitation there. And I think in terms of something for everybody to do, the change has to be legislative and it has to be guidance. Warning notices and practice notices aren't enough. And from the culture change point, every single person in this room can go back and bring this conversation into their company and encourage their company to sign our pledge. And that pledge, as I say, it doesn't really mean anything, but it's about changing the conversation and expecting higher standards from your leaders, from the people in power in your organisation, and from the people you work with.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Zelda. I think it is about everyone. My worry about some of the conversation here is that it's about big corporations, and actually most of us don't work for big corps, or they're medium to smaller company. I run a small medium production company. It is about us being able to talk to each other, and everyone puts out the policies. You know, our lawyer, you know, threw up a policy that we sent out to everyone, and a anti-bullying policy, yeah, and just kind of sent it out. But it's about us creating the culture of saying, yes, talk to us. We will do something about it. It will be in confidence. I would say a lot of staff don't read their contracts clearly enough. They're just so desperate for the work. They look at the remuneration section and they sign it. And they don't know exactly what they're signing. So it's up to us as employers to say, yes, read it. This is what it means. Talk to us if anything goes wrong. And there's, you know, I worry that a lot of the conversation is about big corps. It just doesn't, the problem, you know, the problem is actually, it's the smaller.
Yeah, freelance people are in the worst position.
Yeah, they don't feel they're not protected. They won't go to a lawyer. They can't afford lawyers. I mean, how much was spent on? They can't, £1 million. You're kidding. Some people don't see that in their lifetime. You know, it's a much bigger conversation. It's a cultural change that's slowly happening. People are talking more, especially from our industry, behind the scenes. A lot of that changed when people were in TV after Me Too. It was a huge difference. But actually getting to the point that Zelda got to, you know, and people going to prison, that's still not fair.
Well, we've overrun and lunch is waiting for us. So I just want to thank this brilliant panel once again.